Hello and welcome. You're watching Nothing But the Truth. Today we shall raise questions about Kashmir that are both troubling but also crying out for answers. Was there more to the Handwara incident than meets the eye? Did the army respond somewhat thoughtlessly? And has the time come to rethink the army's role in the valley? But beyond this, there are other questions too. Is South Kashmir witnessing a new militancy? And are we possibly heading towards another hot and troubled summer like 2010? My guest is the former Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir and the working president of the National Conference Party, Omar Abdullah. Omar Abdullah, let's start with what recently happened in Handwara. There seem to be two interpretations. One view is this was an explosion of pent-up anger against an army that is viewed as oppressive, perhaps even as illegitimate. The other view, expressed by former Army Chief General Malik, is this was a rigged incident orchestrated by pro-militant and anti-army elements. What's your view?
I don't think you can rig a protest on this scale, and not to the point where people are willing to lay down their lives because of the sentiment or the feeling. It is a fact that large numbers of people came out. Their anger was directed towards the army because of the allegations that surfaced right at the beginning of an alleged incident of molestation. Now there are two views on that as well, but the fact is that what you saw was a genuine expression of anger and outrage which mushroomed because of the way in which it was initially handled.
So you believe...
So no, I don't believe what General Malik is saying is correct.
You believe this was spontaneous and it was an explosion of pent-up anger that had been building up for a while?
You can't orchestrate protests on this level, Karan. It's not possible, and it's definitely not to the point where people will be willing to take bullets in their chests because of sentiment. Yes, they would probably sit outside the gate of an army camp, some token sloganeering, and then they'd go home in the evening. What you saw was anything but that.
How then do you account for the fact that Kupwara and Handwara used to be considered relatively calm and peaceful areas of Kashmir? For instance, on the day of the alleged molesting, which sparked off everything, Srinagar, Baramulla and Sopore had shut down in response to a Hurriyat call for a band, whilst Kupwara and Handwara remained open. In other words, what happened there seemed to be out of character.
Well, Handwara and Kupwara have sort of have at least in recent years been relatively more calm. There's been less active militancy in the area. Whatever militancy we have seen has been closer to the line of control. But the towns of Handwara, Kupwara and surrounding areas have been by and large calm. Their participation in the elections, and I'm not talking about just the last election a year ago, but even prior to that, their turnout in the elections has always been much healthier than the areas that you just mentioned. But there has been, there is this resentment, let's put it that way, at the excessive presence of the army in the middle of these towns, particularly a couple of bunkers that dot the two towns of Handwara and Kupwara. But even that, I think the people were sort of willing to take in their stride. In this case, the incident of, as we both called it, the alleged molestation, because even on that there isn't enough clarity. But I think that was the spark that lit the fire.
Now, the protests that followed the alleged molesting led to the army firing on crowds, and there were at least 5 deaths. What's your opinion of the way the army handled that situation?
Well, I think the army was put in an incredibly difficult position, and that, I think, was something the state government should have been more careful about. Knowing that the target of the people's ire is going to be the army, and knowing that the army is ill-equipped to deal with law and order protests, I think the state government failed miserably in preempting this sort of a situation. They should have ensured that adequate presence of CRPF and J&K police, particularly those that are armed with non-lethal equipment to deal with public protests, should have been positioned in front of these army establishments, because we knew that the army was going to be the focal point of these protests, and that's exactly what happened.
The interesting thing about your answer is that you aren't taking the line taken by people like Wajhat Habibullah, who said that the army had overreacted, that the army should not have fired to kill, that this was a mistake. You're not taking that line. You're blaming the civilian authorities and the government.
Well, obviously, Mr. Wajhat Habibullah is privy to more information than I am. I'm not privy to how the army opened fire, on what basis they opened fire. All I know is that protesters gathered in front of the army camp. Reports that I read suggested that the protesters tried to break into the army camp and the army opened fire. Now, the army should never have been put in a position where they were forced to open fire, and the only way you could have stopped that was to have ensured adequate police presence and CRPF presence, equipped with non-lethal weaponry, so that they could have dealt with the crowd before it reached the point where it was trying to break into the army camp. I'm not excusing the army for opening fire, but I'm also holding the state administration responsible for putting the army in a position where it had to use fire.
What impact has this had on the way the army is viewed? This is, of course, not the first time civilians in Kashmir have been fired at and killed by the army or by the paramilitary, but there is a view that what happened in Handwara represents some sort of tipping point. Do you accept that view?
I think that would be a bit simplistic. The people of Jammu and Kashmir over the last 25 plus years have seen incidents like this in the past. So to suggest that this is some sort of path-breaking development, or it hasn't happened in the past, and that somehow this incident will cause a much wider ripple effect than other incidents of a similar nature in the past have done, I don't believe that to be the case.
Let's come to some of the lessons that perhaps need to be learned from the Handwara incident. To begin with, do you believe it's critical to remove Handwara-style bunkers, which are clearly so offensive to Kashmiri people, from several other urban centers in the valley?
Yes, but then those bunkers should be removed by choice and not by force, because otherwise the message that is being sent out is that if you protest vociferously enough and set a few bunkers on fire, then we will move those bunkers, otherwise we won't. The people of Handwara had been pressing for the removal of these bunkers for quite some time now. The government should actually have done it of its own free will, rather than reacting to a situation in which 5 people have laid down their lives. Now, if there are other similar bunkers in towns, I would suggest that a call be taken to remove them now, rather than those bunkers become the focal points of protests in the future. Those bunkers get set on fire, and then as a measure of sort of addressing public sentiment, we start removing those bunkers, because that's the wrong way to go forward.
Now,
we removed bunkers from Srinagar. We removed 40 odd bunkers from Srinagar, but we didn't do it on the back of protests directed at those bunkers. We did it as a suo moto gesture, and it worked well.
Now, yesterday, I believe your father, the president of the party and a former chief minister like yourself, has said that this is at a time when AFSPA, which, as you know, is a lightning rod for Kashmiri anger, needs to be either diluted or lifted from specific areas of the valley. How urgent is it that this one long-standing popular demand must be met?
This is something that should have been done when I was Chief Minister and Mr. Chidambaram was the Union Home Minister. Unfortunately, we were the only 2 people in a position to do something about it that felt this way. His colleagues in the cabinet, and unfortunately my allies in the alliance government here in Jammu and Kashmir, didn't feel the same way, and that's why we are where we are today. I believe that the time has come. Then we take a long, hard look at the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, and the sort of sacrosanct aura that has been placed around it needs to be removed. There are areas that are largely, at least up until now, almost free of militancy, and therefore should be considered as areas from which this act can be removed.
So you're also suggesting, if I read you correctly, that the time has come for civilian politicians to call the shots on AFSPA and to override the army's traditional reluctance, to assert themselves and say to army generals, sorry, this is a decision we will take and we will start removing it.
Well, unfortunately, that decision has now been taken out of the hands of the state government. In the agenda for alliance that was negotiated by the late Mufti Muhammad Sayyid Saab and the government of India, this authority to revoke AFSPA has been squarely handed back to the government of India. Therefore, the state government has no role in this. So all we can do is hope that better sense prevails on the government of India, and they're able to take a more balanced view on the revocation of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act.
Now, there's a third lesson that many people are drawing from what happened in Handwara. Once again, I'm quoting former Army Chief General Malik. He says that the time has come to rethink the Army's entire role in the valley. He said the Army cannot continue to be interminably used as a civil police force. He says it needs to be replaced on the streets of Kashmir, either by the police or the paramilitary. As someone who's been Chief Minister, as someone who is there in the state watching the mood and atmosphere at this moment, do you believe the time has come to substantially, perhaps comprehensively rethink the Army's role in the valley?
Oh, he's absolutely right. The Army's role has always been external focus. And it's with great reluctance that the Army gets involved in internal security duties. And I think 25 years is far too long a period for the Army in Jammu and Kashmir to be focused internally. We should have, by this point in time, have developed the numbers and the capacity to have been able to contain the situation using paramilitary forces and the state police. And the fact that we haven't, I think, is an indication of our failure. We tend to be overly reliant on the Army and are less willing to come forward and explore alternatives. But the more we use the Army for internal security duties, the more we place them in a position where incidents like Handwara and Kupwara happen and shouldn't.
In which case, since you agree with General Malik that the time has come to rethink the Army's role and perhaps comprehensively and substantially rethink its role in the valley, on whom does the onus lie to begin that process? On the civilian government in Srinagar, on civilian authorities in Delhi, or on the Army itself?
No, the Army is subservient to the civilian authorities in Delhi. The Army doesn't function as an independent unit deciding for itself. The Army goes where the government of the day in Delhi tells them to go, and they will leave when the government of the day tells them to leave. And therefore it is binding on the Ministry of Defence and the Ministry of Home to together work out a roadmap so that adequate alternate forces can be created and the Army can be pulled back. Now the problem is that keeping the Army deployed in Jammu and Kashmir is an easy option for them, because then they get to use all the other paramilitary forces in Naxalite areas, because they're not going to deploy the Army in those areas. So that's again part of the problem. Oftentimes you find that the Army is deployed in areas that could otherwise have been policed or at least taken care of by paramilitary, because the paramilitary forces are being pulled out into Naxalite areas.
So this is clearly a decision that sits with Mr. Parrikar, Mr. Rajnath Singh and Prime Minister Modi. They have to turn their heads to this and urgently address it.
It's the Cabinet Committee on Security that needs to resolve this.
Omar Abdullah, at this point, let's widen our discussion. What's happened in Handwara and Kupwara may have taken some people by surprise, because these were known to be peaceful, calm areas. But there are many who believe that South Kashmir is caught in the grip of a new militancy that's been simmering and spreading for around a year. Do you agree with that view, and are you concerned about that situation?
No, the situation is a matter of concern, both in terms of the local recruitment into militancy. One sees reports of a large number of youngsters getting recruited into local militant organizations. But also parallel to this is the huge crowds that one sees turning out when local militants or even militants from across the border are killed in encounters, and this new trend that has started of the local population trying to disrupt the encounters so that these militants get a fair chance of escaping. These are not signs that bode well for the future.
To what extent is the social media playing a critical role both in spreading disaffection and perhaps more importantly in fanning fundamentalism and militancy?
No, I think blaming social media would be rather simplistic on our part. That would suggest that we haven't had this problem until the advent of social media. But that's not the case. And more often than not, the sort of people you see participating in these protests are not social media savvy people. So don't go by one or two YouTube videos as sort of the basis for this. Yes, there is one local militant who seems to have established a bit of a presence for himself on YouTube, but that's just, I think, symptomatic of the problem, not the cause of it.
Some analysts fear that the separatist insurgency that's been rumbling in Kashmir since the early 90s could be steadily morphing into some form of pan-Islamist jihad. In your eyes, is that a genuine fear? Are we seeing that happening in South Kashmir, or is this an exaggerated one?
Well, the YouTube videos that I referred to, this local militant who seems to have caught everybody's attention,
is that Burhan?
Seems to be more focused on the religious side of it rather than the political side. He makes very little mention of the resolution of the Kashmir issue, and more of his discourse is directed towards the religion and the need to spread it and things like that. But as of now, his view and his influence seems to be limited just to that. We haven't seen, or at least I haven't seen, any evidence of the widening of this appeal as of now, but it's not something that we should ignore.
One of the fears south of the Banihal line is that the syncretic Kashmiriyat of the valley that was much admired and much cherished is under threat from a more puritanical Wahhabi West Asian Islam. Do you see that happening around you?
Well, it's been under threat for a few years now, and that again is a direct offshoot of the militancy of the last 20-25 years.
So do you get the feeling that the appeal of Daesh, or ISIL as it's called, is slowly but steadily growing in the valley?
Not from a militancy point of view. I have yet to see evidence to suggest that young boys are willing to pick up the gun under the ISIS banner. What I see more often than not is a couple of hotheads unfurling their flag on Friday so that they get a little bit of attention from the television cameras. But I haven't seen evidence to point that these same youngsters are willing to pick up the gun and fight under the banner of ISIS. Jaish and others don't really recruit locally as such. Most of their core strength comes from across the border. And again, I'm not privy to any recent intelligence reports, but at least so long as I was in the office of Chief Minister and I was being briefed by MI and the IB and others, I didn't see anything to suggest this.
Well, let me get a sense of your overview there. Do you agree with the view that what we're seeing in South Kashmir is best described as a new militancy, or do you simply see it as a reinterpretation, a new phase of a much older tradition of militancy?
I think it's a bit of both, and I think it's also the result of the shrinking of space that has taken place because of the alliance between the PDP and the BJP. I think we need to understand that the PDP occupied an important buffer zone between the regular mainstream political parties and the separatists with their soft separatism, the sort of use of Pakistani currency, self-rule, etc., etc. It appealed to a section of youngsters that weren't ready for full integration, but perhaps weren't willing to pick up the gun and demand separatism or azadi or unification with Pakistan. And with the PDP joining the BJP, I think their space or their identity has sort of shrunk, and they find greater resonance with the separatist cause than with the more right-wing now PDP, which has given rise to these youngsters joining active militancy. I dare say that if you were to scratch the surface and look, you would find that a lot of them were perhaps associated with the PDP and the youth wing of the PDP until last year when they allied with the BJP.
So in fact, you do believe that the PDP-BJP alliance has pushed a lot of people who were PDP supporters now away and much closer to militancy. That's one of the fundamental factors that underlies the problem we're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to what you saw in the late 80s when the National Conference and the Congress came together. Political space shrunk to the point where the Muslim United Front was born, and leaders of the Muslim United Front then created the Hurriyat Conference and the Hizbul Mujahideen. I think similarly now you're seeing that with the coming together of the BJP and the PDP, a lot of these youngsters who would otherwise have settled for the PDP's version of soft separatism are now left with no other option but to go the whole hog and demand Azadi or Pakistan.
Then let me ask you this, if history is in a sense repeating itself, is there a danger that we could be heading towards another hot and troubled summer like that of 2010 when we saw street protests, when perhaps 100 and more civilians got killed over that 1 month, 2 month period? Could history be repeating itself there again?
Well, I certainly hope not, and I'd like to believe not for two reasons. I think one, that appetite for that large-scale public protest on the part of the people simply isn't there. Otherwise, you would have already seen it. I mean, 5 people being shot by security forces over the course of 2 or 3 days would have been enough of a trigger for the same thing to have been repeated in Central Kashmir and South Kashmir. But that didn't happen. While people came out and protested, the protests weren't of the violent nature that you saw in 2010. And I think also the paramilitary forces and J&K police are definitely better equipped, both in terms of experience and in terms of equipment. Now what they need is proper direction. I think one of the areas where they failed in dealing with Handwara was that the direction wasn't there. Unfortunately, the Chief Minister saw fit to remain in Delhi and have meetings that were of absolutely no use to the state, rather than rushing back to the state, taking control of the situation and giving the necessary direction to deal with what was unfolding. It's only when she returned back to the state and sort of took an active interest in what was happening that some semblance of normality was restored, but by then we'd already lost 5 precious lives.
I'm particularly interested about one thing, and I suppose this will, in a sense, Omar Abdullah, have to be my last question, that your view of the militancy that's developing in South Kashmir is not that worried and not that anxious as the view in Delhi, and also your fear that we could be heading towards another troublesome summer like 2010 is not at all the fear that people have in Delhi. On both counts, you're much more reassuring.
Well, I think on the militancy front, while it is a cause for concern, I don't believe that it is an immediate problem that is going to flare up overnight. On the repeat of 2010, I think it's also important to understand that in those protests, a lot of mainstream elements also joined in. It's fair to say that the principal opposition party at that time also played a tacit role in helping that situation along. That's not something that's going to happen at the hands of the National Conference here. If anything, we will play a positive role to ensure things remain peaceful in the state rather than trying to score political brownie points by making life more difficult for Ms. Mufti.
Absolutely. As you say, the BJP is now in power, has to carry the can. It can't play the royal spoiler it did when you were in office.
Yeah, and the PDP, both together.
All right, Omar Abdullah, thank you very much for talking to us, and thank you very much for that very well-reasoned analysis of the situation in Jammu and Kashmir, which I think will be eye-opening for many people. That was Omar Abdullah, former Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir and the working president of the National Conference, speaking exclusively to Nothing But the Truth. Goodbye. Good night.